All right, so let's continue our discussion on the process of becoming a law enforcement officer by diving into probation and training. No, we're not actually talking about the position of probation officer, although, would like to acknowledge that probation officers are often overlooked by prospective law enforcement officers. Anyway, upon hiring, law enforcement officers are put on a probationary trial period. This trial usually lasts 1 year, in which the officer is um, essentially like they're kind of scrutinized, they're examined while training, and the idea is that they are supposed to apply their knowledge to real world events. While on the street, recruits ride along with a field training officer or an FTO, as you'll probably see it be referred to in the text. Now, this person monitors their movements and helps them apply principles learned in the academy, or you might also see it referred to as rookie school. While in school, the officers are evaluated and tested by their instructors, who periodically send progress reports to the supervisor. After completing training, new recruits continue to ride with one or more training officers who evaluate their street performance. Officers typically ride with an FTO, or field training officer, anywhere from 2 to 4 months, and train directly with another officer out in the field before going out on their own. The training consists of phases that begin with the probationary officer observing the FTO and ends with the FTO shadowing the probationary officer. So it goes from following to leading. And this is important to consider because in many states, you are a single person squad car, so you should not get used to having two people with you or having someone with you, I guess would be the correct way to put that. Now that that's done, let's discuss why police departments go through this whole process. This is because of civil lawsuits, right? Which, civil, please don't conflate it with criminal lawsuits, although those do usually come in tandem, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's, well, no, it definitely means that they're not the same thing. Because both times they're trying to essentially amplify wrongdoing on the side of the police department or the city, but in one, they're trying to get money, and the other one's usually criminal suits. Um, Civil lawsuits related to training and law enforcement commonly fall under two categories: failure to train litigation and civil liability for injuries sustained during training. Failure to train would involve an officer not rendering the appropriate aid or force necessary for a given situation. Keys to avoiding civil liability related to training are to provide fast rate training, to thoroughly document such training, and to require thorough reports of any incident that could lead to a lawsuit. Now, civil liability for injuries sustained during training is a rather straightforward concept. Basically, police trainers usually are not held civilly liable for trainees' injuries during training. This exemption is based on the legal defense known as the firefighter's rule and the assumption of risk. The firefighter's rule states that a person who negligently starts a fire is not liable for a firefighter injured while responding to the fire. This rule has long been fully applicable to police officers. If an officer is injured confronting a risk or conduct that is basically like required of them to respond to, they can't sue. The assumption of risk defense bars liability if a person is injured as a result of normal dangers associated with an activity a person voluntarily engages in. So something, for example, like extreme sports, same thing. You know what you're getting into. All right, so let's move on to retention. For our purposes, retention and turnover refer to an agency's capacity to stop an officer from quitting. Typically, it says in the text around 8% leave. That number is drastically going to vary depending on departments. Agencies are not the only ones who suffer when officers leave, though. I just want to point that out. Police recruits who voluntarily resign within the first 16 months experience conflict and cognitive dissonance, which means their mind told them to do one thing, but they physically did another thing. With their academy training, field training, and police work, they basically found that it was inconsistent and contradictory to their sense of self and their belief about what police work should be. So they um, couldn't really get with it essentially, and it caused them to quit basically. In addition, Female recruits, gender discrimination was a big part for them of why they would choose to resign. When an employee leaves, replacement costs can include separation costs. They spent money recruiting them, selection costs, new employee costs. There are other soft costs that when a department must stack calls, for example, and forego proactive policing because they're understaffed. Failure to retain an officer ends up costing around $100,000, basically, an additional cost to the police department. Now, why do people leave? Well, there's bad bosses, bad pay, and stress. Bad bosses and bad pay are relatively straightforward. You don't like the person that you're working for, or you feel like you should be compensated more for what you do. Stress is a bit more of a complex issue because everyone understands stress pretty straightforward, but it's different. It manifests differently within people. So, stress comes from several sources, many work related. It may involve change and uncertainty, or things like shift work, lack of control and pressure. Change and uncertainty are unavoidable parts of life and of law enforcement. Officers responding to a call often have no idea what awaits. They may be unsure of who they can trust or even believe. Lack of control may be seen when law enforcement officers apprehend suspects they believe to be guilty and see these suspects not prosecuted or found guilty. Again, they believe one thing and something else is being acted out. Officers must work with assigned partners that they did not select. They must be polite and basically as conscientiously behaved as possible to citizens. Now, shift work is an interesting one. So many people think about this, but shift work is another area that causes stress, especially if shifts change or rotate. So basically, when you go in and when you clock out, 2/3 of patrol officers and administrators have different shift preferences. And this same number, 65%, prefer longer 10-hour work days. They don't always get it though. Sometimes some police departments will work 12-hour shifts, sometimes they'll work 10, and they don't always like the tour that they're working. No one really wants to work the graveyard shift. Pressure is also abundant in law enforcement, with work overloads, paperwork, and sometimes unrealistic expectations from the public, and the responsibility to protect life and property and to preserve, the peace. The need for things like hypervigilance creates a constant level of stress. Officers never know when they might face a critical incident, which is extremely stressful. It's basically an incident that elicits an overwhelming emotional response for those who are witnessing it. Basically a super stressful event, and it can cause this burst stress that the text likes to highlight, which essentially means having to go immediately from a relatively calm state to high intensity, sometimes life-threatening activity. This is closely related to what some scholars refer to as a classic split-second decision syndrome that affects police decision-making in crisis. This split-second syndrome asserts that if a person has intentionally or unintentionally provoked or threatened a police officer, at that instant, the provoker, rather than the police, should be viewed as the cause of any resulting injuries or damages. But, like this, we see that there are unintended consequences of things like this. Things like PTSD, for example. Now, as we wage war on crime and violence, law enforcement personnel may have problems similar to what the military experienced during World War I. I think I had discussed this concept earlier in the semester. Soldiers were experiencing what they called shell shock. In World War II, they suffered from combat fatigue and from battle stress. Psychologists came to realize that officers involved in major catastrophes, such as earthquakes, fires, or even things like rapes, terrorist attacks, could experience similar stress disorders, which we now refer to as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, a clinical name for a debilitating condition suffered by Vietnam War veterans, which now we use in other places because we realize that it's a real thing. An estimated 1/3 of law enforcement officers in the United States experience some form of PTSD. Symptoms include diminished responsiveness to the environment, apathy, disinterest, pessimism, and diminished sex drive. Now, what can be done? Many departments are now realizing that successfully retaining officers begins before the officer is even hired. Conducting can't even read things I wrote. Basically, conducting interviews and providing realistic job previews are crucial in making sure that those who are recruited for the job know what they're getting into. Police managers are also recognizing the greater importance placed by employees on needs rather than salaries, such as training, feedback, recognition, career assignment, and counseling. Retention efforts must maximize and enhance these factors that pull officers into an organization while limiting the factors that push officers out of the agency. And finally, agencies must identify not only those factors that lead to employees leaving, but those that make employees want to stay, because sometimes just getting a paycheck isn't enough. All right. So one of the ways in which officers can reasonably see their work environment being improved, possibly, because sometimes it can be counterproductive, is through unions. Now, unions seek to protect the interests of officers. Um, and one thing that should be, at the very least, brought out was the idea of right to work laws. A right to work law is, it states essentially that someone should not be denied or essentially make the process of getting hired extremely difficult on the account of them having membership in any union or labor organization. Now, some states do, and some states do not have a right to work law. And just to reiterate, these laws grant states the authority to determine whether workers can be required to join a union or keep their jobs without becoming union members. Essentially means that they get to pick whether states, we're talking about here, get to pick whether they want to deal with the unions or not. Now, you might think to yourself, well, what's the big deal, right? Unions, they're there to represent the interests of the workers, which in this case would be the police officers, but they have to deal with collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is the concept of one group using their power together to bargain. So in this case, of the police unions, if you have a police union that has like, every person in the state, or let's just say, I'll use a union like New York, where they all say, if you don't, concede or give us this in the next contract, we're not going to come to work. Now that's actually legal. They legally can't do that. But just for argument's sake, right? The idea is that they can wield their power collectively and all have basically the same exact decision. That we're all going to do this. And that is collective bargaining. That has taken some forms. They have the Fraternal Order of Police, which is actually the world's largest organization of sworn law enforcement officers. So that's something like 350,000 members and more than 2,000 lodges. So very, very big. And there's also be the other group there. It would be the National Association of Police Organizations. It's a coalition of police unions and associations from across the United States, and they were organized for the sole purpose of advancing the interest of America's law enforcement officers through legislative advocacy, political action, and education. All right, so let's discuss the concept of moonlighting. Moonlighting, which is working a part-time job while fulfilling the obligations of a full-time position, has been a source of controversy in the police field for many years and falls within a gray area for some departments, which they prefer to avoid. Most police departments restrict the type of work that can be done and the number of hours an officer can work while off duty. Some cities allow the police officers to work off duty only in police-related areas. Others allow them to work in non-police related areas. So, police related area, highway safety, maybe even some form of security, where non-police, let's say that the police officer has a graduate degree and wants to be an adjunct at a local university, which would be a non-police related area. Although allowing police officers to work off duties have definite advantages, disadvantages also exist, and most cities and municipalities have developed policies that place limits on an officer's off-duty time. Policies on moonlighting address issues such as how to obtain permission for off-duty work, what type of off-duty jobs are not permitted, and so on. Policies must also adhere to the Fair Labor Standards, so FLSA, which basically give us the rules concerning moonlighting officers and the conditions attached to dual employment, joint employment, and special detail work and volunteer work. Standards regarding secondary employment of police officers are among the 673 standards outlined by the Commission of the Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies, which are CLIA standards, for any agency that seeks accreditation. So let's go over accreditation. All right, so accreditation is a progressive and time-proven way of helping law enforcement agencies calculate and improve their overall performances. The concept of accreditation is to encourage agencies to voluntarily, this is super important, voluntarily achieve a high level of professionalism by meeting predetermined standards of operation and service delivery. Agencies are allowed to implement their own procedures to meet the professional objectives set forth in each standard, and they are then evaluated by training, basically by anyone who's trained to assess them, essentially. They're essentially trying to find out whether these processes and procedures have successfully met the standards required for accreditation. Now, CLIA, you remember, every time you see that acronym, it's the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. They were formed in 1979 to develop a set of law enforcement standards and to establish and administer a voluntary process through which agencies could demonstrate that they meet professionally recognized criteria for excellence in the management and service delivery. Now, the commission is the combined effort of the IACP, member International Association Chiefs of Police, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or NOBLE, and the National Sheriff's Association, so NSA, and the Police Executive Research Forum, so PERF. Members of these four organizations approximately 80% of law enforcement community in the United States. The first law enforcement agency was accredited in 1984, and since that time, participation has grown to more than 1,000 agencies. Of agencies of more than 300 or more officers, 500 are participating in the accreditation process. So let's actually look at the phases and the benefits, which are actually listed up here. You have enrollment, sorry about that, enrollment, self-assessment, on-site assessment, commission review, and manipulating compliance, maybe a Freudian slip there, maintaining compliance and reaccreditation. What are the benefits? Greater accountability, reduce risk and liability exposure, stronger defense against civil lawsuits, staunch support from government officials, increased community advocacy. And I know it's not listed there, but I'm pretty sure it's damn near impossible to get federal funding if you do not adhere to the CLIA standards. So just throw that out there. They don't list it, but it's probably implied. All right, so let's talk about professionalism. The most notable advancement in law enforcement recently has been in professionalism. This is partly because 80 to 90% of most police agencies' budgets are allocated for personnel. So basically, hiring people, vetting them. Therefore, agencies are demanding higher quality performance from their personnel. This is sometimes difficult to obtain, however, because many police departments are understaffed. The attrition, which is the rate in which people leave, throughout the United States is approximately 100,000 officers per year, which compounds this problem of being understaffed and creates a consistent demand for training. In fact, training and education are so vital to the success of policing that together they comprise one of the 6 foundational pillars outlined in the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which we discussed earlier in the semester. An equally important force behind the professionalism of police officers is the realization that to a large degree, the future success of law enforcement is contingent upon its police officers' quality and effectiveness, their status in the community, and their ability to serve the community's residents. Throughout this text, right, or I guess another word would be saying throughout this entire semester, really, policing has been referred to as a profession, right? Most people think of it as a profession. However, whether law enforcement technically qualifies as a profession or not is controversial. Part of the problem is that definitions of professionalism vary to a large degree. To some, professional means simply an important job or one who gets paid as opposed to like someone who's an amateur. Sociologists, on the other hand, have identified certain elements that could qualify something as a profession. Um, Essentially, you need to have specialized knowledge, autonomy, and a service ideal. All right, so I'd like you to take a few moments to consider this question. What if you met a bad Apple officer? So someone who you knew was not a particularly great officer, but they probably were not representative of the majority of officers that you would encounter. Knowing what you know now, how much of an impact would it have on your view of the police force as a whole? Take a few moments, consider this, pause the video, and then we'll reconvene when I see you next week. Oh, please don't forget to write it down. All right, please pull out your phone and please take attendance. All right, this is it. This is the end of the presentation for chapter 12. I know this was a pretty short chapter, but I'm happy that we got through it. Hopefully you found it helpful. Now we're done with chapter 12. We are now looking at quiz 4. I should be posting this content probably around Thursday evening, which means the quiz will probably be coming with it also on Thursday evening, latest Friday morning. You'll have into the Sunday to complete the quiz. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I hope you all enjoy your weekend, and for that matter, just the rest of your week whenever you hear this. Thank you.